The Universal monsters are like a family. You always see them grouped together, like on my shirt right here. Like, look at this. You got Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, the Wolfman. I'm sure this shirt stands out really well from this black background behind me, but hey, whatever. So the question I want to ask is, how many monsters actually belong in this family? Number one, it has to be made by Universal Studios. Number two, has to be famous enough to make a big impact. That's the basic criteria, but as we go on, we're going to find this criteria becomes pretty difficult. Let's give it a try. So usually the monsters, they come from the classic cycle of Universal films. Now, what is this cycle? Usually it begins with Dracula. That's what most people consider, 1931. Roughly, it starts with the sound era, the talkies. And if you're going to go by that, then really I think it would be The Cat Creeps from 1930. But that's a lost film, and it doesn't even really have a monster in it, So I don't think anybody's going to count The Cat Creeps. So usually at 1931 is when they begin the classic period. When does it end? Usually around like 1946 with The Brute Man or something like that. If you could just almost push it to 1948 with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, because it's got all the classic monsters in it, and it's kind of like a comedy just as a big send-off, like a farewell to all the monsters. But if you count Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, then you got to count Abbott and Costello Meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and then you're way into the 50s, and then we're kind of past this classic cycle. And if you're into the 50s, then you got to count the Mole People and Tarantula and everything like that, and it just opens up a big can of worms. And Tarantula, as much as I love giant spiders, it's not really a famous enough monster as like Creature from the Black Lagoon. For some reason, Creature from the Black Lagoon always gets added to the Universal family. Pretty often, he's in Monster Squad. And the creature is past the classic cycle. So that's not even just it. We also include monsters before the cycle as well, like Phantom of the Opera, 1925, Lon Chaney. That's a classic monster. You never forget that face. I mean, we're not going to remember the mask. I mean, yeah, a lot of people know the Phantom wears a mask, but what did his mask look like in that movie? You can't remember, because who cares? It's not as interesting as Lon Chaney's face. That's the Phantom. That's the classic Universal monster. Yeah, it's tough because like the 1943 color version, you're not really going to count. That's the one with Claude Rains, and that's a Universal movie, and it's inside the classic cycle, but it's not as famous as the Lon Chaney one, or at least I don't think it's as good. It's not as awesome, So if we're counting movies before and after the cycle, then I say let's reach out and grasp the whole scope. Let's get every Universal monster all together right now. Okay, so let's see. Let's start with the 20s. 1923, Hunchback of Notre Dame. Is Quasimodo really a monster? Not really. He doesn't do anything bad. You can argue the same thing for the Frankenstein monster, though. He doesn't do anything bad. He's just, he's mistreated and he's tortured. It's so similar. Like, it's really on the line. I really feel like I don't want to count Quasimodo as a monster, but it's, the people in the movie view him as a monster, and I think that's what counts. So I'm going to say, number one, the first Universal monster, Quasimodo. Okay, and then number two, we already said Phantom of the Opera. That's a no-brainer. Now we're into the 30s. Number three, Dracula. Number four, Frankenstein's monster. Number five, the Mummy. But wait, is it the classic Imhotep mummy, or, don't people remember the Karis mummy better, I don't know. It's like, it is the first Mummy movie, and the Mummy does start out in bandages, so that is kind of the Mummy that you remember, that's all wrapped up. And it doesn't establish all the cliches, but you could say the same thing for Frankenstein. Like, everybody remembers, like, Igor, and that didn't happen till later on. and everybody kind of remembers Frankenstein, with the arms coming out, and that didn't happen until like Ghost of Frankenstein when he's blind, and then Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. So I guess the first movie doesn't have to establish all the cliches, because later on people remember the Mummy as strangling people with one arm and all that. But the first movie did establish the monster, so yes, we are going to pick the Mummy from 1932. So moving on, we got number 6 is The Invisible Man. Simple. Number 7, Bride of Frankenstein. Even though the monster only appears at the end of the film, it's kind of like the Bride of Frankenstein is so famous. And I think the reason why the bride gets put in the monster family is because we need a female monster somewhere in there. And it seemed they didn't make them enough. But the bride is just so well known, you can't not count her. But then if we count the Bride of Frankenstein, do we count Dracula's daughter? I'm going to say if we do that, then there's really no end to how many monsters we can include. We got to pick the ones that are famous enough. And I haven't seen Dracula's daughter on a cereal box or anything like that. Like, people don't really know Dracula's daughter as much other than, fans like us. And if we count Dracula's daughter, we got to count Son of Dracula. But that opens up a whole debate because the movie Son of Dracula, it's not even his son, or it's debatable. He goes by the name Alucard, but they reveal at the end that he's really Dracula. Now, I've always kind of viewed that as he's one of the Draculas. His name is Dracula because it's a family name. He's a Dracula Jr., perhaps. But really, I think the movie is going for it's really Dracula. And the title is a complete lie. So that's not even a different monster. It's so debatable. And if we count every monster that appeared in its own movie, like, do we count all the Invisible Men? Because every Invisible Man movie is a different guy. And the Invisible Agent, the Invisible Woman, there's really no end. And then do we count supporting characters? Do we count Renfield? How about Igor? They're great characters, but I'm going to argue to put them in a separate category because, that'll have to be a different discussion with a whole list of minor characters. I could go on and on with minor characters. Sander from Dracula's daughter is awesome, but we can't count him in a selective group like this as the universal monster family. Definitely a relative, but we're not going to put him in the immediate group. So I'm going to say they got to be famous enough. And, everyone knows the Bela Lugosi version of Dracula, even if they never saw the movie, but not everybody knows who Renfield is. And Igor in Son of Frankenstein and Ghost of Frankenstein, most people everybody knows the name Igor, but nobody really knows who he is. Most people spell it with an I, for one thing. Igor is a famous name, but he isn't really attached as much to the Lugosi version, even though the Lugosi version we know is the most awesome Igor because we've seen the movies, but most people who haven't don't know. So, and Bride of Frankenstein is minor enough, but she's also famous enough to be considered. So anyway, sorry to go off track, but that's kind of the main point here, is just to really figure out this criteria, because I'm still trying to figure it out right now as I'm speaking. So we're moving on to the 40s. The number 8 classic Universal monster is the Wolfman. There's no doubt about it. And I think he's really the only one from the 40s, because the rest of them are all like sequels and stuff. So we're going to move on to the 50s, and I think once again we get one monster out of the 50s, and that's Creature from the Black Lagoon. Sure, there were tons of them. There was Monster on the Campus and everything, but Creature from the Black Lagoon is the one from the 50s. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the 60s, and as we've seen, most decades seem to have at least one monster. Can we pick one from the 60s? I'm going to say yes. Number 10, Norman Bates from Psycho. You might say that's a stretch because it's hard to imagine Norman Bates sitting there right next to all the other monsters. He would just be like, why am I here? You think I'm a monster? Oh, this is about my mother, isn't it? Well, let me tell you about my mother. He's a monster. He's a human monster, and that's the scariest of all because it can be real. And are we not going to count human monsters? We've been counting them from the beginning. The Phantom of the Opera, he's a human monster. There's nothing supernatural about him. I think that this fits the progression of horror movies because in the 50s it was all science fiction, and then with the creature and all that, and then when we get to the 60s, it's more psychological. So it makes sense that Universal would be updating their monsters as time goes on. So he's also the true predecessor of all the slasher villains to come later. So yeah, I'm going to say he's the Universal monster of the 60s. Now, the 70s. Well, let's turn to nature with another monster that exists in real life. A killer shark, Jaws. May seem like a stretch, like Jaws isn't classic enough to be considered a Universal monster, but if we're only going to pick from the classic era, then really the classic cycle, as we talked about, is the 30s and 40s, so we wouldn't be counting Creature from the Black Lagoon, which is a creature that lives in water. The same thing as Jaws, it's a creature that lives in water. So if we're only picking the 30s and 40s, and we're being that specific, then we would actually want to be even more specific because that's two different waves as it is. Because 1936 was like the last year of really the classic cycle, if you really want to get down to it, because that's when they stopped making the movies. Well, I mean, they were still making sort of horror films. There was Night Key. It's kind of debatable, but they slowed down. It's usually agreed that the second cycle began in 1939. That was like a second wave, and when they started making them again. And when they did that second wave, they kind of ignored everything that came before. Like if you look at Dracula and Dracula's Daughter, Dracula's Daughter is a sequel. It picks up right from the first movie. Those two movies go together. Then Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, again, it's two films that go together. And then once 1939 happened with Son of Frankenstein, they kind of just ignored any continuity of the first wave. And then Son of Dracula, same thing. Like it's not even like Dracula is pretty much in the movie, and they just ignore everything. So they started over. So if we're only counting the classic cycle, that first wave, then we can't even count the Wolfman. So we can be as specific as we want to be, or as broad as we want to be. So I say to get, the whole scope to count the Wolfman and everything, we might as well just go all out and, bring them all together. Does Jaws not really feel like it belongs with the others? Maybe, maybe not. But, there's a VHS tape called Coming Soon, which is a compilation of trailers. They put Jaws on the cover with the other monsters, so it's not like it hasn't been done before. If you can't see Jaws swimming alongside Dracula and the rest, then don't worry, because they all have different settings anyway. Dracula has the castle, Frankenstein's monster has the lab, the Wolfman has the woods, Creature has the lagoon, and Norman Bates has the motel. The shark has the ocean. So they're all so separate, but somehow all united. Was Jaws the last Universal monster? I think so. I think that was when other studios started taking over, and more monsters started coming along. So I think we could talk a little bit about famous monsters that aren't Universal, because there's plenty of them. King Kong, 1933. But King Kong, Universal kind of tried to steal that monster, because they did the remake in the 70s. And actually they sort of combined with Toho to do King Kong versus Godzilla. So in a way, maybe they kind of tried to steal Godzilla too. And then if you really go far, then Nintendo stole King Kong. But, so we're only going to count what they established. It has to be, what Universal did first. But that's kind of going against the criteria a little bit, because Jekyll and Hyde, the one I think about, is from 1931 with Frederick March. That's the famous version to me. But if you go all the way back, the first Jekyll and Hyde movie was 1913, and that was by Universal when they were in their infant stages. They weren't called Universal at the time, but Universal made the first Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde movie. but it's not as famous. But if we also go that way, then they didn't make the first Dracula. Are we going to count Nosferatu as the one, or are we going to count Edison's Frankenstein? It's just which studio really established the monster and made it as famous as it is. The 70s and 80s was when the cycle truly stopped, I think, because then there was Leatherface, there was The Demon and the Exorcist, there's Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, Chucky, Pinhead, Leprechaun. You can almost imagine a whole movie of Universal monsters on one side, like the Justice League or something, fighting against all the non-Universal monsters. That would be a movie, but it'll never happen because it's too good of an idea.